Hidden truths. The untold stories of women's lives in the shadows of war. They used to say that war was a man's invention, a theater of power where men staged their victories and tragedies. Yet in the margins, in the silence between bombs and treaties, in kitchens turned into makeshift hospitals, in cellars trembling under the roar of airplanes, there were women, nameless to the world, but carrying the unbearable weight of history in their bones. The official reports never listed them, but they were there, bleeding quietly, resisting quietly, surviving quietly. And what does survival mean when the silence afterward feels louder than the bombs? The hidden truths begin where the official narratives end. When medals are handed to generals, when parades fill the streets, when nations rewrite their pride, the stories of women dissolve into smoke. Their truth lingers in broken mirrors, in letters burned before they could be read, in scars that no one cared to name. These women did not appear in the newspapers. They were shadows, and yet their shadows held the weight of worlds. War stripped them of everything recognizable. A woman in Poland once said, "They took away my shoes, but worse, they took away my footsteps." She meant that her direction in life was erased, that her path was no longer hers. A simple nurse carrying bandages through mud became a witness to slaughter, stitching men whose names she never knew, holding hands that trembled in languages she did not understand. No one asked her what she saw when she closed her eyes at night. No one asked her what it cost to wash blood off her hands with water so cold it cracked her skin. But the hidden truths are not only about wounds. They are about silence. Silence forced, silence imposed, silence chosen as the only shield left. Women learned to silence their own screams so the enemy wouldn't find their children. They silenced their grief so soldiers would not call them weak. They silenced their desires so that survival could at least look like obedience. And in this silence, entire generations of women carried wars that never ended, wars that continued long after armistices were signed. In every war, there are stories of women whose bodies became battlegrounds. The cruelty of soldiers did not stop at borders or at front lines. It seeped into homes, into barns, into shelters. A woman in Bosnia once whispered, "I am still alive, but my name is no longer mine." What does it mean to survive when survival itself feels like theft? When the war takes not just your husband, your brother, your father, but your very ability to belong to yourself? The shadows of war are not empty. They are crowded with women sewing uniforms until their fingers bled, women hiding fugitives, in cellars so damp they coughed blood, women digging graves with bare hands because there were no men left to hold the shovel. Some stood on battlefields with rifles, others with bread, others with lullabies to keep children from hearing the bombs. Each carried a truth hidden so deep that even decades later, it slips only through tears they can no longer explain. Imagine a little girl in 1942 sitting in the ruins of her school. She doesn't cry. She holds a piece of chalk in her hand as if classes could resume at any moment. Around her, walls are broken, the blackboard charred, her teacher gone. Years later, she becomes a grandmother, telling her grandchildren not about battles or politics, but about the smell of chalk, about the silence of unfinished lessons. That was her war. A war lived in shadows, where the truth of loss was measured not only by death counts, but by lessons never written, songs never sung, dresses never sewn, dreams never spoken. There is a strange cruelty in history. It remembers weapons, but forgets lullabies. It names generals, but forgets midwives. It erects statues of men on horses, but leaves unnamed the women who stitched flags in candlelight, who smuggled bread under coats, who hid secrets in braids of hair so they would not be searched. And maybe that is why these stories must be told now, even if late, even if the women who lived them are dust. Because history without them is not history. It is propaganda. One woman, an Italian partisan, once wrote a note before being executed. "Do not remember me as a victim, but as someone who refused to obey." That refusal is part of the hidden truths. To obey would have been easier, safer, perhaps even survivable, but she chose otherwise. And in that choice, she left behind a fragment of dignity that history tried to erase. The shadows of war also conceal unexpected solidarities. In prisons, women shared crusts of bread, knitted socks out of torn blankets, whispered lullabies to strangers' babies. They became each other's mothers, sisters, nurses, even graves. One would lie on the cold floor to warm the stone so another could sleep for a few hours. One would steal a spoon of soup and pretend she wasn't hungry. One would cut her hair to look like a boy, hoping the soldiers would leave her alone. These were acts of resistance invisible to the world, but they were more courageous than gunfire. And yet, not all truths are noble. Some women collaborated with enemies, trading others' lives for their own survival. Some became informants. Some betrayed neighbors. Some chose to live in silence when they could have spoken. War does not only produce heroines, it produces unbearable choices made in shadows. To judge them now is easy. To live them then was impossible. The shadows of war followed women long after peace was declared. Some returned to homes that no longer existed, others to husbands who came back broken, others to villages that whispered rumors instead of offering solace. They were asked to forget, to move on, to rebuild. But how do you rebuild when the foundation of your soul is cracked? How do you explain to children that their lullabies were sung in cellars so bombs wouldn't hear them? How do you explain scars that don't appear on skin? One survivor of the Rwandan genocide said, "Every night, I wash my body with silence." That sentence is the essence of the hidden truths. Silence became the soap, the shield, the coffin, the inheritance. Women washed themselves with silence so they could walk among the living without frightening them. And in that silence, entire worlds were buried alive. The first part of this series must linger here, in the silence. Before we speak of battles, before we name places, before we draw timelines, we must sit in the cellar with these women, hear the bombs above, feel the trembling ground, and notice the child pressed against their chest. We must notice how the mother tells a story, not to entertain, but to drown out the roar of war. The story is not about heroes. It is about surviving another night, about pretending tomorrow still exists. The shadows of war are full of these stories. And in telling them, maybe, just maybe, the silence will fracture. Maybe the world will finally hear not the sound of cannons, but the whispers of women who never stopped carrying the weight of wars they did not start, wars they did not want, wars they could not end, yet wars that lived inside them forever. The cellar of history is crowded with faces no one painted. If the walls of ruined houses could speak, they would tell us of women kneeling over bodies, whispering names into ears that could no longer hear, hoping the sound of love might pull them back into life. They would tell us of women who lost everything in a single night, and then woke the next morning to continue cooking, sewing, mending, because survival required no permission. War erases names, but women remembered them. In notebooks hidden under mattresses, they wrote the names of sons, neighbors, even enemies, because they knew history would forget. One diary found after the war had nothing but names, pages filled with careful handwriting, each name carrying the weight of a vanished life. When asked why, the woman who wrote it said, "Because if no one writes, they die twice." But the hidden truths are not only about death, they are about life forced to grow in impossible soil. In refugee camps, women braided hair as if braids could weave order into chaos. They told fairy tales to children who had seen too much, changing endings so that monsters always died and mothers always returned. They planted seeds in the cracks of bombed courtyards, watering them with the last drops they had. Some seeds grew, others didn't. But the act itself was resistance, a refusal to let war decide the meaning of life. There is a truth that men's history rarely admits. Wars are not only fought on battlefields, they are fought in kitchens where women stretched, bread into soup for 10 mouths. They are fought in whispers at night when women taught their children to remain silent at the sound of boots. They are fought in the decision to open the door to a stranger and risk everything to hide him from soldiers. These were battles too, but no medals were ever awarded for them. One woman in Greece during the occupation carried bread under her skirt for years. Each day, she fed prisoners she had never met before. She knew she could be shot at any moment. When asked later why she risked her life, she replied simply, "Because hunger sounded louder than fear." That is the kind of truth that hides in the shadows, too raw, too humble, too inconvenient for official histories. The war also demanded from women the cruel ability to choose which child to save first. In famine, one mouth had to be fed before another. Some mothers gave up their own portion. Others gave up their lives. These choices are buried deep, unspeakable, because to speak them would be to relive the impossible. And yet, in every generation, those choices resurface in the eyes of children who never understood why their mother's hands trembled at mealtime. War taught women to live with ghosts, not just the ghosts of the dead, but the ghosts of what could have been. The ghost of a wedding dress that never left the box. The ghost of a lullaby interrupted by gunfire. The ghost of a husband's touch before he vanished into the battlefield. These ghosts are silent, but they haunt kitchens, doorways, beds, and they never age. Sometimes the hidden truths are in scars invisible to others. A woman who carried water through a minefield so her village could drink never told anyone what it meant to hear explosions on both sides of her body. She lived decades as if she were ordinary. Only in her old age did she confess, and her children wept not for what she suffered, but for what they never knew. Another woman, this one a Jewish seamstress, survived a camp by repairing uniforms for guards. For years, she hated the sound of scissors. She couldn't enter a tailor shop. She burned every needle she owned. Her hidden truth was not just survival, but the unbearable weight of surviving by stitching the very uniforms of those who killed her people. How do you tell that story without being judged? How do you breathe when your survival feels like betrayal? There is also the silence of women who never returned. History tells us men went missing in action. But countless women disappeared too, taken from villages, never to return. Some were forced into brothels for soldiers, others into labor camps, others simply erased. Their families waited at doors for years, holding photographs, refusing to believe absence meant death. That waiting itself became a war without trenches, but with endless nights. In the ruins of Stalingrad, a childless woman gathered orphans from the rubble. She had no milk, no food, no medicine, but she wrapped them in rags and sang until her voice broke. When she died, the children called her Mother of Silence. Her grave had no stone, but her song lived in those who survived. That is another hidden truth. Motherhood does not always come from blood. It often comes from ruins. Sometimes women's courage was louder than men's commands. In France, during the Resistance, women transported messages in baskets of bread, in hems of dresses, even in lullabies sung to babies strapped to their chests. Soldiers never thought to search lullabies. They underestimated the genius of survival. They underestimated the sharpness of women who had nothing left to lose. Yet, alongside courage, there is always the wound of invisibility. After the war, many of these women were told to go back to kitchens, to silence, to normal life. The men returned as heroes, while women returned as shadows. A nurse who had saved hundreds of soldiers was told, "You did your duty now. Forget." But how does one forget hundreds of dying eyes calling for their mothers? How does one fold silence over such memories and live as if they were not carved into the skin? The shadows of war stretched across generations. Children of survivors often grew up with lullabies that trembled, with mothers who refused to speak of the past, with houses that carried invisible tension. Trauma passed like inheritance, stitched into gestures, into silences at dinner tables, into nightmares that returned every anniversary of bombings. Even those who were never in the war grew up carrying it in their blood. A woman in Vietnam once said, "My daughter never saw the war, but she was born inside my silence." This is the legacy of war. Not only destruction, but silence that breeds silence, sorrow that multiplies without words. The hidden truths are not just past. They are present, echoing in families, in memories, in the DNA of silence. And yet, in every shadow, there is also a flicker of light. Because to tell these stories now is to break the silence. To speak of women whose truths were hidden is to give them back their names, their dignity, their humanity. It is to say, you were there, and we see you now. As this second part closes, one image lingers. A woman sitting on a step outside a ruined house holding a pair of children's shoes. Her eyes are empty, her lips sealed. She has no words left. But the shoes speak louder than any history book. They tell us everything we need to know about war, about loss, about survival. They tell us that the hidden truths of women's lives are not shadows after all. They are the very light that reveals the darkness. The ruins of war carry an echo that does not belong to cannons or to marching boots. It belongs to women's whispers. When all else collapses, when walls turn to dust and cities to ash, whispers remain, carrying truths that history refuses to hear. They slip through cracks, carried by wind, hidden in lullabies, buried in diaries never published. These whispers are the only proof that women were not mere shadows, but living flames forced to burn in silence. In villages across Europe, Africa, and Asia, women learned to survive by becoming invisible. They blended into the background of rubble, carrying water on their backs, pretending not to exist while soldiers passed. But invisibility came at a cost. Years later, when the war was over, no one remembered the invisible. Their names disappeared from memorials, their sacrifices dissolved into myths, their scars dismissed as private matters. Hidden truths remained hidden because the world preferred silence to confrontation. A grandmother once told her granddaughter, "You think I survived the war, but in truth, the war survived in me." That distinction is crucial. Survival is not an end. It is a burden, a chain of memories dragging across decades. Women carried wars inside them, long after treaties were signed. They carried them in their skin, in their sleep, in the way they cooked, in the way they hushed children's laughter too quickly, fearing noise would invite danger. The shadow of war is not measured only by destroyed buildings, but by destroyed intimacies. Husbands who never returned left women both widows and exiles in their own homes. Families asked them to move on, to remarry, to rebuild. But how does one rebuild with ashes in her lungs? Some did, some remarried, some raised children alone. Others chose silence, carrying photographs pressed against their chests like amulets. Each choice was both survival and surrender, both life and loss. One story lingers from Korea, a young woman forced into a comfort station during the occupation. She returned decades later, too old to bear children, her body scarred with what had been done to it. Her village looked away. They called her spoiled, as if survival itself were shameful. She never married. She planted a garden instead. Every flower she grew was a child she was denied. When she died, the garden withered. Only photographs of her among the flowers remained, silent witnesses to a truth the world never wanted to face. The cruelty of war is not only physical, it is linguistic. Words betray women. Words like collateral damage, civilian losses, comfort women, erase the depth of what they endured. Euphemisms hide violence. Language itself becomes a weapon, reducing lives to footnotes. Women's truths remain hidden not just in silence, but in the cages of the very words meant to describe them. And yet, women found ways to resist this erasure. They carved their names on walls before execution. They embroidered symbols into clothes so future generations might know they existed. They taught children songs that carried hidden messages of defiance. They buried diaries in gardens, hoping someone would one day find them. These were not small gestures. They were revolutions disguised as whispers. Consider the woman who kept a locket with her daughter's hair during the siege of Leningrad. Every day, starving, freezing, she touched that locket. She later said, "It was not jewelry. It was my weapon." Because in that locket lived memory, and memory itself was resistance. To forget would be to surrender. To remember was to fight, even if silently. But there are also darker truths, ones we hesitate to admit. Some women loved men who wore enemy uniforms. Some bore children from those unions, children marked forever as symbols of betrayal. These women lived in shadows not only during war, but long after. They faced stones thrown by neighbors, rejection by families, silence by governments. And yet, is love always treason? Or is it another battlefield, one where the heart fights for survival in ways logic cannot explain? Hidden truths often resist easy judgment. There were women who turned pain into power. In Algeria, widows of men killed in war organized schools. teaching children in secret so their culture would not die. In Spain, mothers passed coded messages baked inside loaves of bread, feeding both stomachs and revolutions. In Rwanda, women rebuilt villages stone by stone, even while mourning husbands and sons. They became architects of futures they would never fully enjoy. Their truth was this: even broken, they still built. And still, the burden of invisibility persisted. After peace was declared, medals went to men, statues were built for men, streets were named after men. Women returned to kitchens, laundries, hospitals, carrying scars that no one asked about. Their silence was convenient. Their suffering, unrecorded, became ghosts in the margins of history. It is as if the world preferred not to remember because remembering would demand accountability. One survivor of the Balkan Wars once said, "When I die, bury me with my silence. It is the only thing I truly own." That sentence reveals the heart of these hidden truths. Silence as property, silence as inheritance, silence as prison. Women carried silence not because they wanted to, but because the world left them no choice. And yet, despite everything, they endured. Endurance is not glamorous. It is not parades or speeches. It is waking up with nightmares, cooking breakfast, anyway, sending children to school, sewing torn clothes, smiling when smiles feel impossible. Endurance is invisible, but it is the thread that keeps the world from unraveling. Women's endurance is the reason generations exist at all. So here, in the third part of this series, we sit again with them. We sit in kitchens where pots simmer, on tiny flames where women hum songs too fragile for words, where scars are hidden under sleeves. We listen, even if they do not speak, because silence itself is a story. It tells us of pain that words cannot carry, of resilience that words cannot honor, of truths that refuse to vanish. And perhaps in listening, we realize something greater. The hidden truths of women in war are not only about the past. They are about the present. They ask us, who remains invisible today? Whose silence is we still ignoring? Which truths are being buried now, waiting for someone to dig them up decades later? The cellar of history is not closed. It breathes. It waits. And inside, women still whisper. If we press our ears against the walls of time, we might hear them. And if we have the courage, we will not turn away this time. The silence of women in war is not empty. It is heavy, layered, and alive. It is the silence of footsteps erased by snow before dawn, of lullabies choked by bombs, of letters burned before eyes could read them. Silence became a survival strategy, a weapon sharper than knives, a shield more enduring than walls. But silence was also a wound, one that bled for generations. In the ruins of Warsaw, women carried buckets of water across rubble, dodging sniper fire. They carried water not for themselves, but for strangers, for neighbors, for wounded fighters they barely knew. One of them, an old widow, once said, "I carried water not to quench thirst, but to prove we were still human." This is the paradox of war. Survival is never only about survival. It is about refusing to become less than human when everything around you demands it. But hidden truths stretch beyond acts of bravery. They include the weight of humiliation, the unbearable intimacy of violence forced upon women's bodies. In every war, soldiers discovered that power was not only about territory, it was about flesh. And women carried those violations in silence, because to speak meant shame, exile, rejection. The war ended on maps, but it did not end inside them. Their skin became battlefields no one marked with flags. One woman from Cambodia, decades after the Khmer Rouge, said, "I am a graveyard no one visits." Her words capture the deepest shadow, how war buries women alive within themselves. They live, but they carry tombs inside. The world celebrates peace treaties, but never asks about the women who live as if war is still inside their veins. There is also the silence of small resistances. A girl hiding in a barn with her siblings cut her hair short and dressed as a boy, so soldiers would overlook her. Another painted dolls' faces with ash, pretending they were her friends so loneliness wouldn't devour her. These acts seem small, almost childish, but they are monumental. They are proofs of imagination fighting against annihilation. They are testimonies that even in the darkest shadows, Women created light with their bare hands. In the mountains of Spain, women carried messages inside loaves of bread. They crossed villages smiling, chatting with soldiers, while inside the bread was information that could shift entire battles. If caught, they would have been killed without trial. Yet they walked anyway. One of them later confessed, "The bread was never heavy. What was heavy was the silence afterward, when no one remembered." To act in war is dangerous. To act and be forgotten is unbearable. The hidden truths also reveal how women were both protectors and betrayers. Some gave shelter to fugitives. Others betrayed them under torture or for food. In war, morality cracks. Choices are not clean. To survive sometimes meant condemning another. These truths rarely make it into textbooks because they complicate the myth of purity, but they are part of the shadows nonetheless. To honor women's truths is not to sanctify them, it is to humanize them. In hospitals improvised inside schools, women washed wounds until their hands bled. They had no morphine, no anesthesia, no gloves. They tore their own clothes into bandages. Many died from infections they never treated, but not before they had saved countless lives. Yet when the war ended, they returned home as if nothing had happened. No one thanked them. Their stories remained in whispers between other women, never reaching the ears of a history that preferred medals over tears. Generations later, children and grandchildren would ask why their mothers or grandmothers never spoke of the war. The answer was always the same: silence. Not because there was nothing to say, but because words could not contain what had been lived. Words were too fragile. To speak meant breaking. Silence became the only language possible. One survivor of Sarajevo put it simply: "We survived by not telling." That not telling is itself a hidden truth. It is not emptiness, but a deliberate choice. A wall built inside the soul to keep the flood from drowning everything. But walls crack. And when they do, truths spill out in fragments. In a tear at dinner, in a sudden scream during sleep, in a trembling hand over an old photograph. And then there were the women who did not survive, but whose deaths were erased twice, first by the violence itself, then by the silence afterward. In every mass grave, there are women whose names remain unknown, women who will never be counted. Their absence is louder than their presence ever was. The world moves on, but the shadows remain. Sometimes the only memorial a woman receives is the memory of another woman. One mother in Rwanda, after losing her daughter, adopted 3 orphans. When asked why, she answered, "So my daughter would not be alone in death." That is how women carried one another across generations, by refusing to let the silence of one become eternal. They built bridges of love across ruins, bridges history never photographed. The war also reshaped motherhood itself. Some women raised children of soldiers who had violated them. They raised them in silence, torn between rejection and love, haunted by eyes that reminded them of war. Some rejected those children, some embraced them. Both choices were scars. Both were truths the world preferred not to see, and yet, women endured. Endurance is not a passive act, it is defiance. To wake up, to cook, to carry water, to plant, to sing, to bury, to nurse, to smile. These are victories when war demands despair. Every gesture became a form of resistance. Hidden truths are not only about pain, they are about the stubbornness of life refusing to vanish. So here in part 4, we return once more to the cellar of history. We sit with the women in the shadows. We hear their silence as if it were music. We see their scars as if they were maps. And we understand. To speak their truths now is not only to honor them, but to confront ourselves. Because their shadows are not behind us. They are inside us, shaping the way we live, the way we forget, the way we choose silence when speech is too heavy. War is not over. Not because guns still fire, but because the shadows it created never left. Women live inside those shadows still, even in peace. And if we are willing to look closely, if we are willing to listen, the hidden truths will speak, not in screams, but in whispers strong enough to break history open. History remembers ruins made of stone, but it forgets ruins made of skin. Women carried those ruins in silence, rebuilding themselves while no one noticed. Their homes may have been reconstructed, their countries declared free, their flags raised. Again. But inside their bodies and memories, the rubble remained untouched. The hidden truths are buried in the everyday, in the way an old woman folds a tablecloth too neatly, as if perfection could prevent chaos. In the way a grandmother stops smiling when fireworks echo, mistaking them for bombs. In the way a mother insists her child eat everything on the plate, because she remembers the years when there was nothing. These are not quirks. They are fragments of wars carried forward in silence. One woman in Beirut described it best. Peace is only the absence of bombs. It is not the absence of fear. And fear became her companion for life. She grew gardens, she baked bread, she raised children, but fear followed her like a second shadow. Fear of boots, fear of planes, fear of silence itself, because silence often came before explosions. Her hidden truth was that she never truly left the war, even though the war officially left her country. The shadows also carried another form of survival: storytelling. Women told stories not to remember, but to transform. They turned horrors into parables, grief into metaphors, loss into fairy tales where children could still believe in miracles. A mother in Bosnia told her daughter that thunder was the sound of angels playing drums. The girl grew up believing storms were music. Only much later did she realize the truth, that the sound her mother disguised was artillery. Yet by then, the disguise had saved her childhood. That is another hidden truth. Lies told in love become a form of truth stronger than facts. But there were also stories women never dared to tell. Some truths remained buried in silence because they were unbearable to voice. The truth of how many nights they were forced, how many times they wished for death, how many times they were abandoned by those who should have protected them. These truths festered inside like wounds never stitched. They were carried in bodies that seemed whole but were fractured beyond words. One survivor of the Holocaust described it with chilling clarity. The worst part was not dying, but learning how to live afterward. Living afterward meant walking in markets, laughing at weddings, eating at tables, while carrying invisible mass graves inside. Women became experts at pretending, at blending into life while hiding death under their skin. They cooked meals with trembling hands, they sang lullabies with broken voices, they kissed children with lips that remembered screams. And yet, even in silence, women built legacies of strength. They taught daughters to study, to vote, to demand rights. They taught sons to respect women, though many societies still resisted. They became the silent architects of progress, their war-shaped endurance turning into lessons for peace. Some never used words. Their lives were the message. Their resilience was the textbook the world should have read, but rarely did. In the Yai, ruins of Berlin after 1945, women known as the Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women, rebuilt the city brick by brick. They carried stones in their arms, cleared streets of debris, reconstructed homes while men were absent or dead. Photographs exist of their bent backs, their weary eyes, their hands raw from labor. Yet their names remain unknown. Cities rose again, but history rarely carved their faces into monuments. Their hidden truth is that nations were rebuilt not only by treaties and leaders, but by women whose hands refused to stop lifting. But the shadows of war are not only past, they ripple into the present. In every modern conflict, from Syria to Sudan, from Ukraine to Gaza, women continue to bear the hidden truths. They flee with children on their backs. They give birth in basements. They bury loved ones in shallow graves. They cross borders with nothing but memories. Their stories repeat, almost identical, as if history refuses to learn. And once again, the world looks away, preferring the numbers of casualties to the names of women. The inheritance of war does not fade, it mutates. Children of survivors inherit silence like an heirloom. They ask questions and receive no answers. They watch mothers cry at night without explanation. They sense tension in gestures, in pauses, in eyes that refuse to meet theirs when certain topics arise. This silent inheritance shapes them, sometimes more than words could. They grow cautious, mistrusting, or fiercely resilient. They carry wars they never lived. And so the question arises, what does it mean to break silence, to tell these truths aloud? Some women found healing in testimony, speaking in courts, writing memoirs, teaching students. Others found pain in it because speaking meant reliving. For some, silence was prison. For others, silence was survival. Hidden truths cannot be forced into light. They must be carried carefully, with respect, with permission. One Cambodian woman said, "If I tell you, you will carry it too. Are you strong enough?" That is the question history must ask itself. Are we strong enough to carry women's truths without burying them again? Are we strong enough to let their shadows reshape the way we understand war? Because the truth is this: without women's stories, history is incomplete. Without their truths, we understand nothing about the cost of war. Men fight for flags. Women fight for life itself. Men measure victory in land gained. Women measure it in children kept alive another day. Men write treaties. Women write lullabies. These are different battlefields, but they are equally real, equally defining. As this fifth part closes, one image remains: a woman standing at the edge of a field of graves, her hands empty, her eyes searching. She is not looking for victory, nor for recognition. She is looking for what was stolen: names, futures, laughter, voices. Her search will never end because what was lost cannot be found. But her standing there is itself defiance, proof that even in shadows, women refuse to vanish. The cellar of history is still crowded, and until these truths are spoken, the shadows will only grow heavier. But if we listen, truly listen, we may finally hear not only the sound of wars lost and won, but the heartbeat of women who carried humanity through its darkest nights. The hidden truths are not carved into stone memorials or engraved in golden plaques. They are etched into trembling hands, into eyes that avoid mirrors, into lullabies sung too softly to be remembered. They are truths carried inside bodies like smuggled secrets, truths that rarely see daylight because the world finds them inconvenient, unbearable, or too heavy to hold. War teaches women the art of invisibility. To survive, they learn to become shadows, walking quietly, speaking less, never attracting notice. But invisibility, once learned, does not end when peace is declared. It lingers. Years later, in markets, in weddings, in schools, women still walk softly as if footsteps could summon danger. They still silence laughter too quickly, as if joy itself were suspicious. This is the shadow's inheritance. The body remembers even when the mind begs to forget. One woman from Vietnam confessed in her old age, "I did not raise my children with love, I raised them with fear. Because I was afraid of losing them the way I lost everything else." Her hidden truth was not about war itself, but about the way war infected love. Even tenderness became hostage to fear. And those children, growing up, learned to live with caution, stitched into their very skin. That is how war multiplies, through silence, through gestures, through invisible threads that bind generations. Yet there are also hidden truths of defiance. In the Warsaw Ghetto, women smuggled bread, letters, and even bullets inside baby carriages. Soldiers saw mothers and looked away, never imagining their greatest enemy walked in plain sight. These women turned motherhood itself into a weapon of resistance. Later, when asked why, one survivor said, "Because the world expected us to be weak, and that was our camouflage." This inversion of expectation was not just survival. It was genius born from desperation. But resistance had many faces. In Greece, women sang songs while working in fields, songs that seemed innocent but carried coded messages. In Algeria, women painted their hands with henna in patterns that marked safe houses. In Rwanda, women whispered in marketplaces, passing news disguised as gossip. These forms of resistance were not written in history books. They were dismissed as folklore, superstition, women's chatter. Yet they carried armies, they saved lives, they preserved cultures. The hidden truths live in these underestimated acts. The cruelty of war is also found in betrayal. Some women were forced to inform on their neighbors, some under torture, some under hunger, some under the unbearable weight of protecting their own children. Their hidden truths are unbearable. They survived at the cost of another's life. History calls them traitors. But who among us can judge decisions made under the noose of starvation and terror? War corrupts morality until survival itself feels like sin. These women lived in shadows not only because the world forgot them, but because they could not forgive themselves. There is another hidden truth. War does not end when guns go silent. For women, it often begins afterward. After wars, women were left widows, heads of households, caretakers of orphans. They rebuilt villages stone by stone. They plowed fields with bare hands. They rebuilt nations quietly while men were celebrated as heroes. Some women were told to return to kitchens as if nothing had happened. Yet their hands remembered ruins, their eyes remembered graves, their bodies remembered hunger. To pretend normality was its own kind of violence. A German woman, after World War II, wrote in her journal, "We were told to forget, but forgetting was another war." Indeed, the demand to erase memories, to bury truths, to silence voices, was as brutal as the bombs. The hidden truths remained unspoken, festering in silence, shaping families and nations in ways unseen. Peace became another battlefield, one where women fought to reconcile memory with survival. And yet, through the cracks of silence, light sometimes broke through. Testimonies emerged. Diaries were found. Stories whispered from grandmother to granddaughter became louder. In Bosnia, women formed associations decades later, breaking silence to testify in courts about crimes committed against them. Their voices shook, but they did not fall silent. Speaking was not only about justice, it was about reclaiming existence. To speak was to prove they were not shadows, but flesh, blood, memory, and will. But testimony comes with pain. To speak means reliving. To relive means breaking. Some women chose silence not because they lacked courage, but because courage sometimes meant survival through forgetting. Both paths, silence and speech, are truths. Both are hidden, both are valid, both are unbearable in their own way. In Palestine, a woman once said, "Every time I tell my story, I bury my son again." That is the cruel paradox of testimony. Truth liberates, but it also wounds. The world asks women to speak, but rarely asks if they can survive the telling. The hidden truths live in that paradox, suspended between silence and speech, between healing and breaking. Children of war survivors often live with these contradictions too. They inherit fragments of stories, pieces of nightmares, silences that make no sense. A daughter hears her mother scream in the night but is never told why. A son sees his mother avoid certain foods but never learns the reason. This inheritance shapes them, teaching resilience, but also leaving holes where understanding should be. These children carry wars they never lived, wars transmitted not by history books but by blood. And so the question remains, how do we honor these truths? How do we hold them without turning them into spectacle, without consuming women's pain as if it were entertainment? Perhaps the answer lies not in telling everything, but in listening differently, in recognizing silence as a form of speech, scars as a form of testimony, gestures as a form of history. Perhaps honoring hidden truths means expanding what we call history itself, accepting that lullabies, recipes, embroidery, gardens, and diaries are as much historical evidence as treaties and maps, because women did not only suffer, they created. They created songs, symbols, shelters, codes, networks, and futures. They created meaning where meaning had collapsed. They created life in places where death ruled. These creations were hidden not because they were small, but because the world refused to see them. To bring them into light now is to reframe history itself. And here, in this sixth part, one image lingers: a woman sitting in front of a cracked mirror, brushing her hair in silence. The mirror reflects not only her face, but fragments of all: the women before her, mothers, sisters, daughters, widows, rebels. She does not speak. She does not need to. The silence itself is testimony. And in that reflection, we see the truth that history has hidden for too long. Women were never shadows. They were the spine holding the world upright when everything else collapsed. The shadows of war stretch longer than any battlefield. They stretch into kitchens decades later, into lullabies sung in trembling tones, into the silence of women who learned to bury their truths under layers of routine. History has always chosen the loud, the generals, the explosions, the declarations. But what truly sustained humanity in those dark times was the quiet endurance of women, invisible and unnamed. Their hidden truths were never written on flags. They were carved into silence. One truth often forgotten is how women became architects of memory. When entire villages were reduced to ash, women carried fragments, photographs tucked into skirts, recipes scribbled in margins, prayers whispered by heart. These fragments were not small. They were civilizations compressed into whispers. A grandmother teaching her granddaughter how to knead bread in a refugee camp was not merely cooking. She was safeguarding a culture that soldiers tried to erase. Each loaf became a rebellion against oblivion. But memory was dangerous. To remember meant to feel, and to feel meant to break. Some women chose to forget, to survive through erasure. They avoided old songs, burned photographs, silenced stories. Their hidden truth was absence, a deliberate void created to keep themselves alive. Yet absence itself became presence, a ghost haunting every silence. Children grew up in homes where history was a locked box, one they were never allowed to open. They grew up with questions unanswered, with shadows unexplained. One survivor of the genocide in Rwanda explained it simply. I raised my children inside my silence. They lived in it as if it were a house. That silence was not empty. It was architecture. It shaped the way those children walked, spoke, trusted. Silence became inheritance. Hidden truths are not only events. They are atmospheres that shape generations without words. At the same time, silence was not always chosen. It was imposed. After many wars, women were told by governments and families alike to move on. Their stories were inconvenient, shameful, destabilizing. Testimonies of violence threatened national myths of heroism. So they were told to forget, to stay quiet, to serve tea at family tables as if nothing had happened. To speak was to risk rejection. To stay silent was to disappear. The hidden truths remained in that impossible space. In the Balkans, decades after the war, some women finally spoke. They sat in courtrooms describing crimes that had been unspeakable for so long. Their voices shook, sometimes broke, but they refused to stop. One woman said, "I speak not because I want to, but because silence was killing me." For her, testimony was not liberation, it was survival. Speaking did not erase the pain, but it shifted the weight, making it shareable, making it real, in the eyes of the world. Yet testimony has limits. To speak is to relive, and reliving reopens wounds. Some women did not survive the telling. Their hidden truths surfaced only in fragments. Unfinished diaries, coded embroidery, whispers overheard by children. These fragments may be incomplete, but they are still sacred. They remind us that history is not made only of full sentences. It is made of half-broken words, of sobs between silences. There were also women whose resistance was invisible but decisive. In occupied villages, women sabotaged enemy supplies by mixing sand into flour, by sewing uniforms with weak stitches, by hiding maps under laundry. These acts seem small, almost invisible, but they saved lives. They disrupted armies more than bullets sometimes did. Yet when the war ended, men received medals, and women's sabotage was forgotten. Their hidden truth was that victory often rested on their invisible shoulders. But not all truths are heroic. Some women collaborated, willingly or unwillingly. Some bore children of soldiers. Some betrayed neighbors. Some sought survival at any cost. These stories complicate the narrative, but they are truths nonetheless. To ignore them is to create myth, not history. To honor women is to honor all. Of them, the betrayed and the betrayers, the heroes and the broken, the silent and the outspoken. War is not clean, neither are its survivors. One haunting truth is how war reshaped intimacy. Many women married not out of love, but out of necessity, seeking protection, stability, or a chance to feed their children. Some entered unions with men they did not choose. Some remained alone, carrying love stories that ended in gunfire. Romance was a luxury war could not afford. And so, countless women buried not only husbands and sons, but also their own desires. Their hidden truth was, unlived love erased futures. Even in peace, shadows persisted. Women who endured violence often found themselves stigmatized. Communities turned against them, treating them as tainted rather than wounded. They carried shame that was never theirs to carry. Some moved away, some disappeared. Some chose never to marry or bear children. Their lives became living testimonies to society's cruelty, a cruelty that did not end with war but continued in peace. And yet, despite all of this, women built futures. They taught children to read, they rebuilt schools, they planted crops in fields that had once been battlefields. They rebuilt not just walls, but souls. Their resilience was not glamorous, it was daily, invisible, monotonous. But it is precisely that monotony that saved humanity. History celebrates victories with fireworks. Women celebrated survival with bread, with songs, with gardens, and survival, though quieter, was the greater victory. A Japanese woman after the bombings of Hiroshima once said, "The world wanted to know about the bomb. I wanted to talk about my daughter's dress." That dress, singed and torn, was her truth. For her, the bomb was not politics or strategy. It was the absence of her child. This is the essence of hidden truths. Wars are experienced not in treaties, but in kitchens, in cradles, in empty chairs at dinner tables. As this 7th part closes, the image that remains is of a woman kneeling in soil, planting seeds in a crater left by a bomb. Her hands are dirty, her body thin, her eyes tired. But she plants anyway. Not because she believes the seeds will grow, they may not, but because planting itself is defiance. Planting is testimony. Planting is proof that even in shadows, life insists on itself. That is the hidden truth. Women carried not only the weight of war, but also the fragile promise of tomorrow. The deepest shadows of war are not found in trenches or battlefields. They live in kitchens that smelled of ashes instead of bread, in bedrooms where silence replaced intimacy, in lullabies whispered too quietly to be remembered. The war did not just destroy cities, it reshaped the very rhythm of daily life, bending women's existence into something unrecognizable, something half alive, half absent. The hidden truths rest in objects no one notices: a scarf with stains that never washed out, a pot that boiled only water because there was no food, a doll missing an arm carried by a child through refugee camps. These objects speak louder than cannons because they contain survival in its rawest form. One widow in Lebanon kept a single key after her home was destroyed. She wore it around her neck for 50 years. When asked why, she said, "Because as long as I had the key, the house was not entirely gone." That key was not metal, it was memory, resistance, refusal. There is also the truth of waiting. Women waited endlessly, at windows, at borders, at stations. They waited for sons who never returned, for letters that never arrived, for wars to end that seemed endless. Waiting became its own form of war. One fought in silence, one measured not in bullets but in days, weeks, years of suspended breath. Some women waited so long that waiting itself became their identity. A life defined not by what happened, but by what never came. In the Middle East, one mother waited decades for her missing child. Every day she set an extra plate at the table. Neighbors mocked her, relatives told her to stop, but she refused. "If I stop setting his plate," she said, "it means I killed him with my own hands." Her hidden truth was faith disguised as ritual, a way of keeping her son alive through persistence. But not all waiting was faithful. Some women stopped waiting, even when their men returned. Husbands came back from war as strangers, silent, broken, violent. Homes became battlegrounds of another kind. Many women endured abuse in silence, believing that after so much war, to abandon a broken man was betrayal. Others left, carrying guilt and freedom in equal measure. Their hidden truths were written in bruises never photographed, in divorces never spoken of, in children raised with questions no one answered. The shadows also contain women who fought directly. Partisans, nurses, couriers, even soldiers. Some carried rifles, others knives hidden in baskets of bread. Yet after the war, many were erased, their contributions dismissed, their courage forgotten. A Russian sniper who had killed dozens of enemies returned home and was told never to speak of it. A French resistance fighter was denied recognition because she was a woman. Their hidden truth was that heroism had no gender, but memory did. And what of the women who never fought but still carried the war? Those who gave birth in barns while bombs fell, those who buried their children in unmarked graves, those who pretended to believe in tomorrow so their children could sleep tonight. They were not fighters in the eyes of history, but they were soldiers in the truest sense. They carried life itself through the fire. One haunting story comes from a woman in Bosnia. During a massacre, she lay on top of her child, covering him with her body. Bullets grazed her back, but she did not move. The child lived. She survived. When asked years later what she remembered most, she said, "The silence of his breathing under me. I thought if I moved, I would lose him." That silence became her war. That silence became her truth. The hidden truths also carry betrayal by society itself. Women who suffered violence were often blamed. Communities whispered about them, shunned them, called them ruined. Their scars became marks of shame, not honor. Some women never married. Others married but lived in silence, never telling their husbands, their children, anyone. Their hidden truths became tombs inside their bodies, and yet even tombs can bloom. Some women turned their pain into movements. They gathered other survivors. They demanded recognition. They testified in courts. They forced the world to look at truths it had long buried. These acts were not only about justice. They were about reclaiming life, refusing to let shame dictate silence. Speaking became their weapon, their act of war against forgetting. But not all found that path. For many, silence remained the only possible shelter. One Japanese survivor of Hiroshima said, "I never told my children what I saw. I wanted them to believe the world was beautiful." Her hidden truth was sacrifice, not of her body, but of her voice. She carried the weight alone so her children could carry hope. Silence in this case was not cowardice. It was love. What unites all these stories is contradiction. Silence and speech, betrayal and resistance, despair and hope. Women lived inside contradictions, carrying them like double-edged swords. They laughed while grieving, loved while fearing, lived while half dead. Their truths do not fit into neat categories. They are messy, painful, human. And perhaps that is why history ignores them, because they refuse simplicity. As this 8th part closes, one image rises. A woman walking through ruins at dawn, carrying a basket of bread. The city is shattered, walls broken, smoke rising. But the bread is warm, wrapped in cloth, fragile yet alive. She walks not for herself, but for others waiting in silence. Her steps echo louder than bombs because they carry the truth that life persisted, even in shadows, even in silence, even in ruins. The silence of women in war is not absence, it is density. It is heavy, layered, full of unspoken words pressing against the walls of memory. When we think of war, we think of noise, cannons, airplanes, orders shouted across trenches. But when women remember, they often remember silence. The silence of hiding, the silence after explosions, the silence of empty chairs. That silence was not peace. It was weight. It was terror. It was survival. Hidden truths reveal themselves in fragments, not in grand speeches. A torn photograph found in the lining of a coat, a lullaby sung without words, only hums, because singing aloud would attract attention. A spoon carried across 3 refugee camps, scratched and bent, yet still used every day. These fragments do not tell the whole story, but they carry the soul of it. Women's wars are preserved in crumbs, in threads, in objects too small for monuments yet too heavy to throw away. One woman in Syria told an aid worker, "I have no house, but I carried the curtains." When asked why, she replied, "Because I wanted my children to believe that one day they would sleep under something familiar." That curtain was her hidden truth, an anchor of normality dragged through chaos, a refusal to let war erase the memory of home. The shadows of war are also measured in absence. Women bore the absence of men, fathers who never returned, sons lost in battles, husbands turned into strangers. They bore the absence of safety, the absence of certainty, the absence of choice. And yet, in all that absence, they had to create presence. Presence for children, for the elderly, for the wounded. They had to pretend strength even when their bones trembled. They became the fabric holding torn families together, even when they themselves were unraveling. But hidden truths are not always noble. There were women who abandoned their children in orphanages, unable to bear the weight. There were women who betrayed neighbors to save themselves. There were women who took food from the mouths of others. These truths are rarely spoken because they complicate the myth of feminine resilience. But they are truths nonetheless, and they deserve recognition. To be human in war is to be fractured. And women, like men, carried fractures too deep for easy forgiveness. Another truth rests in shame. After wars, many women who had been violated were not seen as survivors, but as dishonored. They were rejected by families, shunned by villages, silenced by societies that preferred to erase rather than confront. Some never married, others hid their pasts behind masks of strength. Their silence was not chosen, but enforced. And in that silence, entire histories vanished. Their hidden truths remain only in the nervous gestures of descendants who sense wounds but cannot name them. Yet alongside shame, there was defiance. Women found ways to reclaim dignity in the smallest of gestures. In Bosnia, some survivors embroidered handkerchiefs with patterns of flowers, even in camps. In Chile, during dictatorship, mothers carried photographs of their missing children into the streets, refusing silence. In Rwanda, widows formed cooperatives, weaving baskets that told stories through colors and shapes. These acts may look like crafts, but they were rebellions, quiet, persistent rebellions against erasure. And then there is the question of memory. Who tells the story and who listens? Men wrote official histories. Governments built monuments. But women passed truths in kitchens, in lullabies, in gardens, in whispered advice. Their truths rarely left the home, but they shaped generations. A child may not know the details of war, but he grows up knowing to fear loud noises, to distrust uniforms, to feel sorrow at anniversaries. That is how hidden truths travel, not in books, but in atmospheres. A woman in Argentina said, "I never told my daughter what happened, but she knew. She knew by the way I flinched at footsteps. She knew by the way I held her too tightly." Silence communicates. Silence educates. Silence imprints itself deeper than words. Hidden truths are not always spoken. They are lived. Some women broke the silence in unexpected ways. They wrote poetry, they painted, they sang. Their art was dismissed as private, domestic, irrelevant. Yet in truth, it was testimony. A quilt stitched from scraps of uniforms is not just fabric. It is an archive. A song sung to a baby while soldiers marched outside is not just music. It is resistance. Women's art became the museum of hidden truths, though few recognized it as such. And yet, even art cannot capture everything. Some truths are untranslatable. Some experiences break language itself. One survivor of the Khmer Rouge said, "I cannot tell you what I saw. If I told you, I would take away your sleep forever." That refusal is itself testimony. It tells us that the horrors women carried were not only hidden, they were uncontainable, too vast for words. Their silence is not emptiness. It is a scream turned inward. The hidden truths are also about time. War distorted time for women. Waiting felt endless. Loss was permanent. Trauma replayed itself daily. Decades later, many women lived as if the war were still happening. They cooked as if scarcity remained. They saved bread crusts as if famine still lurked. They woke at night as if bombs still fell. Time did not heal. Time froze. The hidden truth is that for many women, war never ended. It simply became invisible to others, and yet, despite everything, women planted futures. They taught children to read. They built schools in ruins. They held on to rituals, traditions, songs, prayers. They carried fragments of culture across borders, replanting them in foreign soil. Without women, entire civilizations would have vanished. They were the archivists of humanity, even as humanity ignored them. As this 9th part closes, one image lingers. A woman sitting on a bench in a rebuilt city, watching children play. To the world, it looks like peace. But in her hands, she clutches a small object, a spoon, a photograph, a key. She cannot let it go, because it is the last proof of a life erased. The children laugh, the city thrives, but her eyes are elsewhere, still in the shadows, still carrying truths no one has asked her to tell. And perhaps that is the greatest tragedy of all. Not that women suffered, but that their suffering was never fully seen. The shadows of war live not only in ruins, but in rhythms. In the way a woman sets the table, always leaving an empty chair. In the way she folds clothes too carefully, as if neatness could protect life from chaos. In the way she insists on silence. At night, because once, silence was survival. These small gestures seem ordinary, but they are archives of hidden truths. They are the body's way of remembering when memory itself is too painful to voice. A grandmother in Poland once admitted, "I don't remember the dates. I remember the sounds." Sounds became her calendar. The echo of boots, the whistle of trains, the silence after bombs. Her history was not written in books, but carved in her nerves. Many women carried their wars this way, through sensations, not words. Hidden truths live not in official records, but in trembling bodies that never stopped feeling the war. There is also the truth of loss, disguised as normal life. Women who lost children still cooked for families. Women who endured violence still went to church, to weddings, to markets. Their survival required masks, and those masks became permanent. Some wore smiles like armor. Others wore silence like skin. To outsiders, they looked ordinary. Inside, they were ruins no one entered. Their hidden truths were invisible because they had learned to perform life flawlessly. One of the cruelties of war is how it demands performance. Women were expected to be strong for their children, supportive for their husbands, loyal for their nations. Their pain had no stage. Their grief had no audience. They wept in corners, in cellars, in bathrooms, in silence. And because no one saw, the world assumed it did not exist. But hidden truths do not vanish. They wait. They press against the surface of memory until cracks appear. The cracks often appeared in the next generation. Children grew up with mothers who startled at footsteps, who overprotected, who never spoke of the past but carried it in gestures. These children inherited fear they could not name. Some became restless, others cautious, others angry. War seeped into them like poison passed through blood. They carried battles they never fought. The hidden truth of women in war is also the hidden inheritance of their children. But there were also moments of fierce resistance that history ignored. In occupied France, women ran underground printing presses, producing pamphlets that fueled the resistance. In Greece, women smuggled weapons disguised as firewood. In Africa, women carried coded messages in baskets of fruit. These acts were small in appearance but monumental in effect. Yet when the war ended, their names were missing from medals, their contributions dismissed as auxiliary. Their hidden truth was that victory rested partly on shoulders history refused to see. And what of the women who could not resist, who surrendered, who collaborated? They are part of the shadows too. Some chose survival through alliances with soldiers. Some informed on neighbors to save their children. Some did nothing, simply enduring, waiting for it all to end. These stories are uncomfortable. They disrupt the myth of women as pure victims or heroines. But war leaves no one pure. To honor women's truths is to honor complexity. The war also reshaped womanhood itself. Motherhood became weaponized, used as camouflage for resistance, exploited as vulnerability by armies. Some women gave birth in ruins, cutting umbilical cords with pieces of glass. Others lost pregnancies from famine or violence. Still others raised children born of soldiers who violated them. Each of these stories is a hidden truth, rarely spoken, too painful to fit into neat categories of heroism or suffering. One woman in Rwanda said decades later, "I love my son, but when I look at him, I see war." Her words were not rejection, but confession. Love and pain lived together in her body, refusing separation. Her hidden truth was not only survival, but the impossibility of reconciling survival with love. War rearranges emotions until they no longer fit the world's vocabulary. And yet, through all of this, women created futures. They rebuilt schools, planted fields, taught children to read. They carried cultures in lullabies and recipes, in rituals. performed even in exile. Without them, entire peoples would have vanished. They were the archivists of survival, their hidden truths woven into bread, songs, gardens. History ignored these contributions, but humanity survived because of them. The tragedy is not only that women suffered, it is that their suffering was erased. Their endurance was dismissed as ordinary. Their resistance was overlooked. Their silence was mistaken for absence. The hidden truths of women in war are not hidden because they are small. They are hidden because the world chose not to see them. To see them requires confronting uncomfortable realities. That victory was built on women's unpaid, unrecognized sacrifices. That survival was carried on their backs without acknowledgement. One haunting image remains. A woman standing in a rebuilt city, holding a photograph of her younger self. In the photograph, she is smiling, wearing a dress long since gone, standing beside people long since buried. She looks at the photograph, then at the city, then at her own reflection in a shop window. She is three women at once, the one before the war, the one who survived it, the one who remains in its shadow. Her hidden truth is that she carries all three, and none of them are fully alive. As this 10th part closes, we must remember, silence is not emptiness. Silence is a language. Women spoke it fluently in war, carrying truths too heavy for words. To listen to their silence is to honor them. To ignore it is to betray them once more. And so, the task remains. To keep digging in the shadows. To keep finding the fragments. To keep bringing to light the truths that have been hidden for too long. The farther we move from the wars of the past, the deeper the shadows seem to grow. Time does not erase, it conceals. And in that concealment, women's truths become harder to find, harder to voice, harder to honor. Yet they remain, pulsing, under the surface of memory like embers refusing to die. The silence of women in war is not absence, it is persistence. It endures because it was never given space to be spoken. Hidden truths survive in gestures. In the way a mother tightens her grip when her child crosses a street. In the way an old woman refuses to waste a single grain of rice. In the way laughter stops abruptly when footsteps echo outside. These gestures look ordinary, but they are remnants of extraordinary terror. They are the language of women who carried wars inside their bones long after the bombs stopped falling. One woman from Sarajevo said years after the siege, "I cannot eat in peace. Every meal feels stolen." She had survived famine, she had stolen bread to live, and so abundance felt unnatural. Her hidden truth was that survival did not heal her relationship with life. It distorted it. She lived in plenty, but her spirit still starved. War reshaped not only bodies, but also time itself. For women, days became elastic. Hours of waiting, stretched into eternities. Minutes of terror lasted forever. Years of silence passed in a blur. Afterward, they measured life not in calendars, but in memories. The year of the famine, the winter of the bombing, the day the silence was too loud. History writes in dates. Women remember in sensations. Their hidden truths are not chronological. They are emotional cartographies, maps drawn by scars. And then there are the truths carried in objects. A ring kept in a pocket, too small for a finger after decades. A comb missing teeth, carried through refugee camps. A book without its cover, read by candlelight during air raids. These objects are shrines. They hold more weight than medals, because they carry intimacy. They tell us not of battles won or lost, but of humanity preserved in fragments. Women's wars were preserved in these talismans, unseen by the world, but sacred to those who held them. But not all women carried relics. Some destroyed them. Some burned letters, shredded photographs, buried clothes. Their hidden truths were acts of erasure, attempts to kill memory before memory killed them. Yet destruction is also testimony. To burn a letter is to confess its unbearable weight. To bury a dress is to admit its pain. Silence can destroy, but destruction itself speaks. One of the most painful truths is how women's bodies became extensions of the battlefield. Rape was not collateral. It was strategy. It was weapon. It was used to destroy families, to mark communities, to humiliate nations. Women carried these wounds not only in flesh, but in silence, because silence was forced on them. Communities treated them as shame, not as survivors. Their hidden truths became double: the violence itself and the silence imposed afterward. Yet even in the darkest wounds, women resisted. Some raised children born of violence with tenderness that defied expectation. Others chose not to, refusing to let war dictate their motherhood. Both paths were courage, both were scars. Both were truths the world still struggles to face. The hidden truths also lie in betrayal by society. After wars, widows were sometimes seen as burdens. Survivors of violence were seen as tainted. Women who resisted were accused of stepping out of their place. Nations rebuilt economies and governments, but they rarely rebuilt women's dignity. That rebuilding was left to women themselves, stone by stone, word by word, silence by silence. Still, women's endurance was unmatched. They rebuilt schools where children learned again, even if under roofs patched with tin. They sewed clothes from old uniforms, turning symbols of death into garments of life. They planted fields where bombs had fallen, growing wheat in soil soaked with blood. Their hidden truth is that they were not only victims, they were architects of survival, engineers of resilience, poets of persistence. But recognition never came. Men returned from war as heroes. Women returned as shadows. Their scars were invisible, their labor unacknowledged, their endurance taken for granted. The tragedy is not only what women endured, it is how the world refused to see it. Their hidden truths remained hidden because to reveal them would demand that we rewrite history itself, and yet fragments still surface. Diaries are found, testimonies are spoken, photographs reappear. A letter from a mother to her daughter, never delivered, tells more about war than any treaty. A lullaby recorded decades later carries the memory of nights when singing meant survival. These fragments remind us that hidden truths are not gone. They are waiting, buried in silence, ready for those who are willing to listen. One image lingers as this 11th part closes. A woman sitting by a river, her reflection trembling in the water. In her lap rests a book with missing pages. She runs her fingers over the empty spaces, where words should be. She does not cry. She does not speak. Yet her silence tells the entire story, that the war did not only destroy lives, it destroyed words. Her hidden truth is not in the book itself, but in the absence within it. Absence as testimony, silence as scream. The shadows of war stretch not only across battlefields, but across lifetimes. Women carried them into kitchens, into marriages, into motherhood, into old age. They did not hang medals on their walls. They hung silence. They built lives around absence, crafting routines so strong that no one noticed the weight beneath them. But silence does not erase, it preserves. Every gesture, every hesitation, every ritual is a fossil of the war buried in the body. One woman in Greece once confessed to her granddaughter, "I cooked every meal as if it could be the last." She lived decades after the occupation, yet every plate of food carried urgency, fear, gratitude, despair. That is the paradox of survival. It transforms the ordinary into the extraordinary. A loaf of bread is no longer just bread. It is memory. It is defiance. It is the weight of every famine endured. The hidden truths are not only about what women lost, but about how they learned to live afterward. After ruins were cleared and streets rebuilt, women carried wars in invisible suitcases. They carried them in nightmares, in trembling hands, in mistrust of silence. Some never spoke. Some spoke only in fragments. Some told stories disguised as fairy tales. Their truths were always disguised, never raw, because rawness risked breaking the listener, or themselves. But silence was not the only inheritance. Resilience was too. Children of survivors learned strength from mothers who endured everything. They learned that survival could be woven into lullabies, sewn into clothes, baked into bread. A woman who had carried her baby across borders barefoot later taught that child to walk with pride. That pride was her hidden truth, dignity forged from ashes, And yet, resilience came with scars. Many children also inherited fear. They grew up with mothers who startled at noises, who stored food obsessively, who distrusted strangers. They did not understand why until later, if ever. Trauma traveled invisibly, like a shadow stitched into blood. The hidden truths of women became the hidden burdens of their children. There is also the truth of isolation. Women who survived violence often lived in double exile, exiled from their homes by war and exiled from their communities by shame. Some lived alone, carrying memories no one wanted to hear. Others remarried but never told their new husbands what had happened. Their hidden truths remained locked, festering, shaping their bodies until illness itself became testimony. Some grew sick not from age but from silence. But some women broke the silence even when it cost them everything. In Bosnia, survivors testified in courts about crimes committed against them. In Rwanda, women spoke publicly about genocide, even as their neighbors turned away. In Latin America, mothers of the disappeared walked in plazas holding photographs of children taken by dictatorships. Their testimonies were not welcomed. They were disruptive, inconvenient, destabilizing. But they were necessary. To speak was to refuse erasure. To speak was to live. Still, not all chose to speak. For many, silence was mercy, toward themselves, toward their children. One Japanese woman, a survivor of Hiroshima, said, "If I tell you, I will put my pain into your body. I want you to live free." For her, silence was not cowardice, but love. Her hidden truth was sacrifice, not of her life, but of her story. She carried it alone so her children could carry hope. The hidden truths also live in contradictions. Women loved men who wore enemy uniforms. They bore children who carried the faces of soldiers they hated. They prayed for peace, but sometimes hoped for revenge. They endured violence, but also committed violence when survival demanded it. Their truths are not neat. They are fractured, contradictory, human. To honor them is to accept complexity, to reject the temptation of simple narratives. In every war, there were women who resisted not with guns, but with persistence. They planted gardens in bombed courtyards. They sewed dresses from scraps of uniforms. They sang lullabies while bombs fell. These were not small acts. They were revolutions disguised as daily life. Their hidden truth was this: to live when death surrounded you was itself defiance. And yet, the tragedy is how little recognition they received. When wars ended, men were paraded as heroes, while women returned to silence. Their endurance was considered natural, their sacrifices invisible, their truths unnecessary. Nations built statues of soldiers but not of mothers. History recorded battles but not breadlines. Memory celebrated victories but ignored the shadows where women held humanity together. But silence cannot last forever. Fragments always surface. A diary found in an attic. A letter hidden in a drawer. A song passed from grandmother to child. These fragments reveal what history erased, that women were not shadows, but the foundation of survival. Their hidden truths are still waiting, scattered in archives, in stories, in objects, in memories. As this 12th part closes, one image remains. A woman sitting at a table in a rebuilt home, serving food to her family. She smiles, but her eyes are far away. On the table sits a simple loaf of bread. To her children, it is just dinner. To her, it is a memory of famine, of hunger, of nights when bread was more precious than gold. Her hidden truth is baked into that loaf, an entire history, contained in silence, served daily without recognition. The silence of women in war often looked like ordinary life. To the untrained eye, it was a mother braiding her daughter's hair, a grandmother sweeping the floor, a wife hanging laundry in the courtyard. But underneath these gestures lived storms that no one could see. Ordinary acts were survival rituals, disguises carefully stitched to conceal unbearable truths. One woman in Ukraine once said, "If I kept washing clothes, the world could not fall apart completely." That was her hidden truth, that chores became anchors when reality dissolved. Each garment scrubbed in freezing water was not just fabric cleaned. It was hope kept alive, order preserved, defiance disguised as obedience. The world looked at her and saw a woman doing laundry. But she was holding civilization together with soap and silence. Women's wars are measured differently. Men counted bullets, territories, bodies. Women counted children fed, nights survived, secrets kept. Their wars were fought in cellars, kitchens, hospitals, refugee camps, and yet because their weapons were lullabies and bread, their victories were dismissed as minor. But what is greater, winning a battle or keeping a child alive another day when the world itself is collapsing? Hidden truths live in voices hushed forever. Many women never told their stories, not because they lacked courage, but because speaking meant reliving. They chose silence as a shield, not weakness. A woman in Cambodia once explained, "Every time I tell my story, I die again." So I stopped. Her silence was her resistance, her survival. Her hidden truth was that words could kill just as much as bullets. And then there are truths carried in shame, shame that never belonged to the women, but was forced onto them. After wars, survivors of sexual violence were rejected by communities, called dishonored, treated as if their wounds were sins. Some were abandoned by husbands, some were forbidden to marry. Their hidden truths lived not only in the violence itself, but in the cruelty of being silenced afterward. They bore the shame of others while carrying scars that should have been met with reverence, not rejection. In Rwanda decades after genocide, one woman whispered, "The men who hurt me walk free. I am the one imprisoned." Her prison was not walls, but silence. Her hidden truth was that justice often failed women, leaving them to carry entire wars inside their bodies alone. Yet women also transformed silence into resistance. In Chile, mothers of the disappeared walked through plazas with photographs of their children pinned to their chests. In Bosnia, survivors gathered to testify together, breaking silence as a collective act. In Argentina, women carried cooking pots into the streets, turning kitchens into protests. These acts were not just political, they were sacred. They were the reclamation of truth from the shadows, but not every woman found that path. Some carried their truths to the grave. Diaries were buried with them, stories untold, names unspoken. Their families discovered only fragments, scraps of letters, half-finished songs, photographs with faces cut out. These fragments became clues to lives hidden forever. The hidden truths of women in war are often archaeology, digging through ruins of memory, piecing together what silence refused to reveal. There is also the truth of women who were neither saints nor martyrs, but simply human. Some betrayed neighbors to save themselves. Some abandoned children. Some collaborated with enemies. These stories are uncomfortable, but they are part of the shadows too. To honor women's truths is not to sanitize them. It is to embrace their full humanity, fractured and contradictory. And still, even in contradiction, there was resilience. Women rebuilt homes brick by brick even when their own bodies were broken. They planted gardens in soil blackened by bombs. They sang lullabies to children not their own, children orphaned by violence. They stitched together futures out of scraps, of pasts. Their hidden truths were not only about suffering, but about the audacity of creating life in the middle of death. One old woman in Berlin remembered carrying stones after the war, helping rebuild a city. She said, "I carried bricks not because I wanted to, but because if I stopped, the city would remain in ruins forever." Her truth was that survival demanded labor without recognition, strength without applause. She became a builder of history, yet her name never entered the books. The greatest tragedy is that nations celebrated peace without acknowledging the price women paid for it. Men marched in parades, received medals, wrote memoirs. Women went back to kitchens, hospitals, schools, carrying scars no one asked about. Their hidden truths remained hidden because the world preferred stories of victory to stories of survival. But survival is the truest victory of all. As this 13th part closes, one image lingers. A woman sitting at a sewing machine in a small room lit by a single candle. She stitches torn clothes late into the night. Each stitch is neat, precise, almost ceremonial. To her family, it is mending. To her, it is memory. With every thread, she sews together fragments of a world that once tried to tear itself apart. Her hidden truth is that survival was not loud. It was quiet, steady, stitched into fabric that outlasted war itself. The shadows of war do not vanish when the ruins are cleared. They follow women into the quiet corners of their lives, whispering in the dark, settling into gestures no one questions. A smile too brief, a silence too long, a hand that trembles. When touched, these are the living archives of history. They are not stored in museums, but in bodies, not cataloged in books, but in glances, not honored in ceremonies, but in hidden truths carried through time. For many women, survival meant performing. Normality, they cooked, they laughed, they raised children, they went to church. But beneath the surface, they lived with ghosts. Every meal prepared was a memory of hunger. Every lullaby sung was an echo of nights when bombs shook the earth. Every silence held screams unscreamed. To the world, they looked whole. Inside, they were mosaics of brokenness, fragments glued together with silence. One woman in Rwanda said, "I smiled so my children would not see my nightmares." Her hidden truth was that love demanded disguise, that her laughter was not joy, but protection. Many women lived like this, hiding sorrow under masks of strength, teaching resilience by pretending peace had returned when it never truly had. But silence has weight. Over years, it bends bodies, slows steps, clouds eyes. Some women carried their truths until illness became their testimony. Stomachs ulcered by swallowed grief, hearts weakened by suppressed screams, bodies collapsing under burdens that words might have lightened. Their hidden truths were written in disease, in pain that medicine could not cure because it came not from flesh, but from silence. And yet, silence was not always prison. Sometimes it was shield. One Japanese survivor of Hiroshima refused to tell her children the horrors she saw. "I wanted them to believe the world was good," she said. Her silence was sacrifice. She carried the poison alone so her children could breathe freely. Her hidden truth was that silence can be both wound and gift. Still, some broke the silence, even when it shattered them. In Bosnia, women testified in courts, naming crimes no one wanted to hear. Their voices shook, but they did not fall silent. In Argentina, mothers of the disappeared marched weekly, photographs of their children pressed against their chests. They turned mourning into protest, silence into song, absence into presence. These acts were not only political, they were sacred. Rebellions against erasure. But not every woman became activist. Not every woman spoke. Some chose quiet endurance, building life out of fragments, protecting their children from truths too heavy. Both paths are truths. Both are survival. Both deserve honor. The hidden truths also live in contradictions. Some women loved men who wore enemy uniforms. Some bore children who embodied both violence and innocence. Some betrayed neighbors to save their families. These contradictions are not betrayals of womanhood. They are testimonies of humanity under siege. War breaks morality into pieces, and women like men are forced to live among shards. Another forgotten truth. Women carried culture through war. They braided songs into lullabies, hid recipes in memory, whispered prayers even when faith faltered. They became living libraries. Without them, entire languages, traditions, and rituals would have vanished. Nations survived not only because of treaties, but because women hummed old songs in cellars, teaching children to remember who they were. Their hidden truth is that survival is cultural as much as physical. And yet, when peace returned, recognition did not. Men returned as heroes. Women returned as silence. Their endurance was expected, their sacrifices dismissed, their voices ignored. The tragedy is not only what they endured, but how the world pretended it never happened. Their hidden truths remained. Hidden because history preferred parades to whispers, medals to lullabies, monuments to kitchens. But fragments endure. Diaries surface. Songs are recorded. Photographs reappear. These fragments pierce silence like light through cracks. They remind us that history without women's truths is not history. It is myth. And myths cannot heal. Only truth can. One image remains at the close of this 14th part. A woman standing in a field of wildflowers, her hair gray, her body frail. In her hand, she holds a photograph folded so many times it is almost torn apart. She does not show it to anyone. She looks at it, then tucks it back into her pocket. The field sways with wind, bright and alive, yet her eyes remain in shadows. Her hidden truth is this: even in beauty, war lingers. Even in peace, silence speaks. The war ends on paper before it ends in flesh. Treaties are signed, borders redrawn, soldiers return, or don't. But inside women's bodies, inside their memories, the war lingers like smoke trapped in lungs. Long after the guns fall silent, women keep fighting invisible battles, against silence, against shame, against forgetting. These battles have no parades, no medals, no anniversaries, yet they are the longest wars of all. Hidden truths do not vanish with time. They are passed like heirlooms, folded into lullabies, woven into recipes, carried in gestures. A granddaughter may never hear her grandmother speak of war, but she will notice the way she locks doors 3 times, the way she never wastes food, the way she flinches at sudden noises. These are silent legacies, whispers carried through blood. Wars outlive themselves in women's habits. One woman in Lebanon told her daughter, "I cannot tell you everything, but I will tell you enough so you never forget that silence can be deadly." Her truth was partial, fragmented, but it was all she could bear. Women often transmitted half-truths, fragments softened by time to protect the next generation. And yet, even fragments carry power. A single story can save memory from extinction, but countless stories never surfaced. They remain buried in graves, in lost letters, in unmarked photographs. The hidden truths of women are also absences, things never spoken, memories erased by choice or necessity. These absences are heavy. They are like empty chairs at tables, always present though invisible. To honor women in war is not only to tell what they endured, but to acknowledge what they chose, or were forced, to withhold. Some silences were merciful, some were cruel, some were chosen, some imposed. This is the complexity of hidden truths. They are not uniform. They are contradictions, fractures, shadows layered upon shadows. One woman's silence protected her children. Another's silence imprisoned her for life. One woman's testimony healed her. Another's testimony broke her. There is no single story. There are thousands, each valid, each incomplete, each carrying weight. And yet, despite the weight, women endured. They rebuilt houses brick by brick, fields row by row, families word by word. They planted gardens in soil still stained with blood. They sewed dresses from fabric cut from old uniforms. They turned ruins into homes, silence into songs, absence into presence. Their hidden truth is that survival itself was an act of defiance. To live was to resist the erasure war demanded. Still, the world rarely saw them. Statues honored soldiers, not mothers. Streets bore the names of generals, not nurses. Textbooks recorded battles, not breadlines. The tragedy is not only that women suffered, but that their suffering was erased, their endurance dismissed as ordinary. The hidden truths of women in war remain hidden because history prefers noise to silence, victory to survival, heroes to humanity. But fragments survive. Diaries surface in attics, letters are found in boxes, songs are remembered by grandchildren. A recipe carried across oceans is recognized as testimony. A scarf passed down becomes a relic. These fragments pierce silence, reminding us that women's truths cannot be erased completely. They wait, patient in shadows, until someone chooses to listen. And listening is the work of the living. To honor women in war is not to romanticize them, nor to sanctify them, but to hear them in their silence, in their contradictions, in their resilience, in their wounds. It is to accept that history is incomplete without them, that no story of war is whole unless women's truths are spoken. One survivor of Bosnia once said, "I don't want pity, I want memory." Memory is the truest justice. Not courts, not monuments, not medals, memory. To be remembered not as shadows, but as women who endured, resisted, rebuilt, and carried life forward when death surrounded them. So as this long journey through the shadows comes to an end, one image remains. a circle of women sitting together in silence. Some old, some young, some with faces lined by age, others with eyes still carrying fear. They do not speak. They do not need to. Their presence is enough. Each carries a hidden truth, and together they form a chorus of silence louder than any anthem. Perhaps that is the final truth. Women in war are not only survivors of history, they are history itself. Not written, not sung, not celebrated, but lived. And though their truths remain hidden, they are not lost. They breathe in fragments, in silence, in resilience. And if we dare to listen, really listen, we will hear them. Not as whispers, but as the heartbeat of humanity that refused to die, even in its darkest night.